Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, former state representative from southern Minnesota. As usual, we're joined by State Representative Walter Hudson of District 30A. In Washington, D.C. this week, the conservatives are demanding that the federal government make at least some attempt to reduce spending, while big government Republicans and socialist Democrats push to raise our nation's debt limit near $33 trillion. If you're a taxpayer, you already owe the government more than $246,000. If you're married, that's over $500,000 for the both of you. In St. Paul, the government's dealing with its share of the trillions of dollars of D.C. overspending, and they have a $17.6 billion surplus. Governor Walz released his plan to spend it, including hundreds of millions, on a program to feed our hungry children, eerily reminiscent of the $250 million fraud that was just uncovered, which Ellison's making a weak attempt at prosecuting. We'll get Walter's reaction later in the show. Thursday, tomorrow, for those of you watching today, the House will vote on removing all restrictions for abortion. That's House File 1. I've heard rumors that Republicans are going to be asking members to kind of lay down the resistance, and we'll talk with Walter a little bit in more detail on what the plans are. In the Children and Families Committee, Walter's seen a desire to open up the floodgates again of taxpayer money that's used for childcare and to feed the same fraudsters who stole $150 million a year for many years from our taxpayers. In the Public Safety Committee, just ahead of the bills to take your guns, Walter speaks about a bill that criminalizes certain speech. I'll also ask Walter about his stance on returning and restoring American citizens who are no longer a threat to society to restore their right to vote. All this and more on the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. All right, Walter, we got a busy show. First of all, I need to ask you about this House File 1 that's coming to the floor tomorrow, Thursday this week. It'll likely hit the Senate maybe Friday so that Governor Walz can sign it into law on Sunday, which is the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. What are some of the amendments? I think they're going to be posted here momentarily. What are some of the amendments that Republicans are going to be offering to this bill that just takes away all restrictions on abortion in our state?
Well, I think you're likely to see amendments that were already offered and voted down by Democrats through the various committees where this bill was heard. So, and we've talked about them all before. Requirements that abortions in the second and third trimester be performed in a hospital as opposed to fully unregulated clinics that have less government scrutiny than a barber shop or a popcorn stand. Bans on third trimester abortion. Which is something that most people think is relatively reasonable. Certainly a ban on partial birth abortion, where the baby is almost entirely outside of the birth canal, wriggling around, fighting for its life. And we go in there and snip a hole in the back of its head and suck out its brain. Literally. I mean, it sounds like a horror movie, like a comic dark horror, but it's real and it happens. And the Democrats will push back on that one and say, well, that never happens or it rarely happens. Okay, good. Let's ban it then. Let's make sure it never happens. But they don't want to. They vote it down, which is an odd play for something that they say never happens. So I think you can expect that and amendments similar to that, where basically what we're trying to say as a House Republican caucus is these folks are not where you're at. Where they are not where Roe was. Okay, because we have Doe v. Gomez in this state. We had Roe v. Wade in this country for 50 years. And within that period of time, we all know that there were bans on partial birth abortion. There were bans on third trimester abortions. There were requirements for facilities to be regulated in several states throughout the union. And so and people agreed with that. Pro-choice people agreed with those common sense, reasonable restrictions. And that's not good enough. Roe, which the dictates of Roe v. Wade are current law in the state of Minnesota, but that's not good enough for Democrats. They want this to be the most radical state in the union and on par with the most radical nations in the world. We're going to be equal to China when it comes to our unborn child killing policy. And that's what we're basically going to let them step on the rake, right? Like they want to do this. They want to show the world who they are. And we're going to be standing there like Vanna White saying, ta-da, here they are. What do you think?
Well, there's some Democrats that are in somewhat vulnerable districts that could be forced to vote on amendments. In fact, you could offer amendments that are some of the moderate restrictions on abortion that Democrats proposed in the first place. Right? They're the ones that, I mean, this is talking about decades of laws that they're undoing every single restriction on abortion, every single common sense safety precaution. They're just ripping away, including parental rights, because this is now going to impact children, children who are pregnant, and it's just going to be, I think, a missed opportunity for not trying to get some of these Democrats on the record. But we'll watch the amendments as they're posted and watch the votes tomorrow on the House floor, and I'm sure we'll have a good recap in the next episode.
Well, let me clarify that. My expectation with those who are offering amendments, and I believe the procedure is such that anybody on the floor can request a roll call vote at any time. The intention is to get roll call votes. I mean, we want votes on these amendments. We want people to see who they elected and what they believe. So that's definitely the objective.
Yeah. Well, I know that there's some meetings down in Rochester, legislative meetings that have been canceled on Friday, expecting that the session in St. Paul will probably go late. So we'll see what happens. One of the bills we talked about over text before the show was a bill in public safety that you discussed. That's kind of a restriction on speech. Can you explain that, Bill?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've quickly learned down here in St. Paul is that, especially when it comes to the things these Democrats are proposing, you can't really see at first glance what it is that they're actually trying to do. So they'll write a bill that says they're trying to expand the definition of protected class in the Human Rights Act to include gender identity. And you look at that and you're like, oh, okay, what's that about? And you start digging around looking for that. And then you discover something else in the bill that's the actual thing they're trying to do, that's much more horrendous than what you might have imagined based upon the description of the bill. And that's what happened with this bill that we heard in public safety earlier this week, which basically what it does is it creates the pretext for speech police. So what it does is it says we're going to create a reporting mechanism through the Department of Human Rights. I believe that's a department that exists. It sounds like something Minnesota would do. We're going to create a reporting mechanism through this department for people to report not crimes. And that's the thing. The bill, as originally drafted, referenced crimes, but then the author in the committee put in an amendment to scratch out crimes and put in incidents. So incidents of bias, incidents of hate are going to be recorded in a government database, reported by anyone, and subject to no due process or verifiability or anything, just assumed to be correct for the purposes of creating data, which they can then reference as they go forward to continue to lobby and write new bills and conjure new agencies and find justification. They're basically trying to create their own evidence for what they really want to do down the road. And they want to do it by building off of actual or perceived, that's the actual language in the bill, actual or perceived incidents of racial bias, which may not even be associated with an actual crime. And all of this was said out loud in committee. It was extraordinary. They sat there and they talked about how, we need to combat hate. And this is a bill to help us fight back against hate. Well, what is hate? That's a question I asked in committee, by the way. What is hate? And I didn't get an answer, of course. And the phrase that really stood out to me was this phrase, incident not involving a crime, or something to that effect. So they're specifically saying we want to keep records of non-criminal speech. We want to know where it's happening. We want to know who it's happening to. And to the extent possible, we want to know who's doing it for reasons that we're going to keep to ourselves, right? Like, they're not telling us what they want to do with the information. Well, we want to know where the problem is. Oh, okay. What, like for its own sake? No. You know what you want to do with this information. And it's all about crafting narrative. That's another thing that I very quickly learned down here, is that this place is all about creating new official departments and offices and what have you, to be able to conjure data points to lobby for the next office or department or budget or whatever it is. It's the snake eating its own tail.
Yeah.
And this is an example of that. That, by the way, the ACLU came out against this thing. That's how bad it is.
That's when you know it's bad. Well, I mean, certainly the Democrats want to restrict free speech, and they use the word hate speech, which I know hate speech is a bad thing, but it is, we live in a country with free speech where hate speech or speech that makes you feel bad or upsets you is
Right.
allowed. And that's one of the greatest things to free speech, is that you have to listen to someone scream at the top of their lungs something that just infuriates you, knowing just you're gonna hate hearing it, but there's beauty in having free speech, because you know that sooner or later you're gonna have an issue that you want to speak out against, and you can't have your speech silenced by the government. And so you're right. The What you're describing is just bureaucracy growing government. One of the things I thought was interesting is that every bill that comes forward can have a fiscal note assigned to it. So they go out and they determine how many people this bill will create in government, how many staffers have to be in this department. And then when the bill passes, that much money is allocated to that new department or that department head, and there's no follow-up to find out if that person ever hired those people. So all this money's allocated. Many of those jobs were never actually created or filled, but the department still gets all the money. Dwayne Quam had a great bill a few years ago to actually follow up and make sure that the department actually hired the people, or to take the money and put it back in the general fund, which is a good way to you could cut probably billions of dollars in government, because all this money is sitting out there and not being used. So that's interesting, and thank you for having the foresight to look at this bill for what it really is, and to understand that they're just trying to restrict free speech in the future. Now, in the Children and Family Committee, you heard a bill to kind of open the floodgates to send more money to childcare providers or to families or to counties to pay for childcare. Can you explain that legislation and kind of lay out the debate as it
Well,
happens?
so this wasn't a bill. What this was, as you well know, they'll sometimes have presentations, especially early on in session. They'll have agency presentations where an agency of the state will come in and say, "Here's who we are and what we do," and or they'll spend time trying to educate the members about the jurisdiction of the committee or what have you. So this was one of those presentations, and it was put on by the inspector general for that must have been the Department of Human Services, because we're talking about CCAP, which I believe is managed by Human Services. And so basically what it was, I mean, they didn't say this explicitly, but what it was them trying to put forward the narrative that all that CCAP fraud from a few years back, that was then, this is now, everything's kosher now. We've got new and improved processes in place. We've made enhancements to our inspecting and our generaling and the things that we do here at the Inspector General, and we're all on top of it, and you got nothing to worry about, and you're a-okay. You've got the green light to just go ahead and dump millions more into this system that saw by some reports up to $100 million worth of fraud, right? So it ended up triggering a nice little back and forth between the Republican and Democrat members on the committee, having the opening to talk about CCAP again, right? And so we're talking about the fraud, and they're asking, and they ended up getting hung up. A few of the members ended up getting hung up with the chair, Dave Pinto, on the question of just how much CCAP fraud there was, because the original reported number had been $100 million. And there had been some various investigations into that. And the Office of the Legislative Auditor which we should note, has very limited capacity. They are not an investigatory agency. They do examinations, they do audits, they don't investigate potential crime. And so with that limited scope, they came back with a report that was not able to verify the $100,000 or the $100 million number. And so, of course, Democrats latch onto that and they're like, oh, it was never proven. It was never proven, because the Office of Legislative Auditor said, well, there's other testimony from other investigations where that number was affirmed as being a likely estimate of how much fraud there was, and potentially more than 100 million. So anyway, so we end up getting stuck in the weeds of arguing over what the number is. And so I saw that as an opportunity to make the point that, guys, it's been 5 years. How do we not know with absolute certainty to the penny what the number is? Like, isn't the fact that we're sitting here arguing about it 5 years later indicative of the actual problem, which is that you obviously lack the capacity to discern the amount of fraud that occurred in this system? And of course, there was no good answer to that, because I asked the inspector general, I'm like, well, you talk about these enhancements that you have made in recent years and how wonderful they are. Well, explain it to me. Like, how, show me, tell me, give me an example of how the processes you have in place instill you with confidence that we will not only be able to detect waste, fraud, and abuse going forward, but that we'll be able to quantify it, that you'll actually be able to tell me what the number is going forward, seeing as how you can't tell me what the number was 5 years ago. And of course, I got some non-answer gobbledygook. They deferred to talking about, well, there's ongoing investigations and we can't talk about what's happening in ongoing investigation. I'm not asking about an ongoing. And by the way, this all got cut short by the fact that the DFL majority cut our committee time in half because they moved a session up to an odd time. They've been playing all these games to the process around here in order to stifle the minority voice as much as they possibly can. The proponents of democracy, mind you, the folks who are constantly telling us how valuable it is to be engaged in this process and make sure everybody's voice are heard, have been doing everything they can to make sure that the minority's voice is heard as little as possible. They've been trying to push for caps on the amount of time spent debating on the House floor and anything they can to just be able to push their agenda through with as little scrutiny as possible.
Yeah. And I want to give the listeners some background on the CCAP. So CCAP stands for Child Care Assistance Program. It's a federal program that Minnesota also throws money in the pile as it comes in. But the report that came out several years ago was after a Fox News reported Somalis carrying like $100 million in cash to Somalia and trying to trace where that money came from. And it turns out that they had a childcare center that didn't exist. And they were taking, tens of millions of dollars from Minnesota taxpayers, or actually American taxpayers. And so they did this audit, and you're right, they couldn't definitively say that the money was fraudulently stolen, because in order to do so, you'd have to have cameras set up 24 hours a day to prove that children were not going to these centers. But what they did find is that there were several childcare centers that didn't even exist, that there wasn't even an address correct, or it was an empty warehouse and was never a childcare center. But the way that this scam worked is that it was predominantly in the Somali community, where people would get, about $15,000 to $20,000 per child in childcare subsidies that would go to the childcare center. But you had to have both parents working. So the dad worked and the mom would get a job at the childcare center serving food, which was catered every day. And they would bring their kids down, have lunch, and leave. And but they would get, they would split the money with the childcare operator. And in fact, letters to the investigators actually said, how can I make a profit if I have to split, this money with the parents that I'm getting? I mean, there was just outright open fraud. And one of the investigators for this department wrote, I think it's a 12 or 13 page letter that's an appendix to that CCAP investigation report or audit report, where he just lays out that it's $150 million every year that they were stealing. And they hadn't actually visited a childcare center to verify it. Many of them were never, ever visited. It was ridiculous. And so Carolyn Ham, who was the inspector general for DHS, was finally fired. There was an investigation about her, but it was never really resolved. In fact, with the $250 million in the Feeding Our Children money that was just discovered, that fraud, and I think all but one of the 50 people are Somali. They found out that many of those people who are currently indicted for stealing money from the government still have childcare centers open and running and are taking money out of DHS. That's how the fraud continues. And they had the same addresses from the Feeding Our Children program as the childcare centers. I mean, it's the same group of people that are stealing in these programs. It is not resolved, and you should not open the floodgates of money to increase the money for CCAP.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, is that if I'm going to vote, which they don't need our votes, but if I'm going to vote to put more money into these programs, I'm not going to take your word for it. Oh, we have enhancements. They're dropping all this flowery language, trying to bedazzle us with their sense of progress. And it's like, no, you need to walk me through. You need to show me what happened before, how it happened, and what you have done that is going to prevent it from happening in the future. And until you do that, you're not getting another dime. That is an extraordinarily reasonable request, but the DFL ain't hearing it.
Yeah. And I wish, part of the accountability that I was pushing for is to make sure that the businesses who are receiving the benefit of this childcare assistance, because they get to have employees who can then put their kids in childcare, that the businesses are partnering with this program so that they have skin in the game. That if their employee is defrauding the government because they're stealing money, then the business also is on the hook for payment for this. I mean, somebody has to pay, whether it's people that use this program, that they have they have money that they have to put into it, or it's a loan against their estate, like some of the Medicaid programs. There just has to be more accountability than just thinking that it's a free for all from the government, from taxpayers, with no accountability. And there's childcare providers that are hurt because the rates keep on going up for everybody around them, and if they don't take CCAP, the children that they take care of are going to go to these other programs because the parents are getting kickbacks from some of these childcare centers. It's just
Right.
it's a fraud. So much of it is a fraud, and they thought over half of the money being redistributed from Minnesota to these programs is being taken fraudulently.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing, is that there's this issue of how do you define fraud? Because I think for the DFL, the bar that they've set for what qualifies as fraud is extraordinarily high. Like, you would have to have a dude dressed in like what was that guy, that character from McDonald's, the guy who stole the hamburgers, Hamburglar. You'd have to have a guy in a Hamburglar uniform, with a bag that had a dollar sign on it, prancing out of a childcare center, in order for them to finally be like, oh, yeah, sure, I guess that's fraud. When in reality, even if there were children attending these facilities, are they getting the care that is expected? Like, are people watching them? Are they being provided with programming? Are they getting the full service that side of the transaction? Because that too is fraud, right? Like, if I have a plumber come over and he only pretends to fix my drain, but he takes my money and leaves, that's fraud. And that too was happening under CCAP. We know that was happening because they said as much, that there was problems with kids being unsupervised and lack of supervision and what have you. So this issue is much broader than the Democrats have ever acknowledged. And that right there, the failure to acknowledge and the failure to detail, the unwillingness to know the full scope of the problem, is a problem. And I'm not interested in providing more money to a system that is not interested in being accountable.
Yeah. Walter, I'm going to have you weigh in on what's going on in Washington, D.C. And I know it's outside your wheelhouse. When you're in the state legislature, you're just laser focused on local issues, but this really ties into it, because your surplus in the state is a direct result of the trillions of dollars that was spent by the federal government, money we didn't have, which was just thrown into the debt. But right in this week and in the next coming months, actually, they're going to be debating on whether to raise the nation's debt limit, which is like your credit card limit, right? The nation's credit card is at $32 trillion. And they can't even afford the minimum payments due on the credit card. So they want to just print more money and add it to the debt, but they can't do that because the debt limit is set at 32 trillion and change. So they want to increase it. And the conservative holdouts, the House Freedom Caucus members, are saying, look, if we're going to agree to raise the debt ceiling, then we need to also cut discretionary spending. So you need to make this is just not sustainable. And for some reason, the media is reporting, oh, these conservatives in DC are going to just destroy the economy because they're asking for some fiscal responsibility. I mean, where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I mean, you're playing the same record that we've heard 1,000 times before. I mean, this has been an ongoing refrain for many years across Republican and Democrat administrations, Republican and Democrat control of the various chambers of the legislature in Washington. Washington just cannot stop creating money out of thin air, charging up the credit card to be paid off by our great grandchildren. I mean, the generational debt that's being passed on as a result of the drunken sailor spending taking place in Washington, D.C. is unconscionable. I mean, it's one of the greatest moral crimes we have perpetrated as a nation, and that is saying something. Okay, I mean, for all the talk, the 1614 project or whatever it is, wanting to talk about the history of slavery and America being a terrible place, all of that is overwrought. But it is true that terrible things have happened here, right? Like, we acknowledge that terrible things have happened in this country, and it's to our credit that we've managed to abolish some of them, some of the most egregious examples. But I think in the annals of history, far enough down the road, one of the things that will be noted as a silent atrocity is the fiscal irresponsibility, particularly of the federal government, that just has no regard whatsoever for the consequences of their actions. And so, I do think this is a good thing. I think that you should get something in exchange for raising the debt limit. I don't know why that's such a unreasonable or odd idea. The fact that you have to raise it is indicative of a problem. So why aren't you trying to solve the problem? And by the way, you say it's outside my purview. I do see it modeling the process that we have here in St. Paul to a large degree, because so far, a lot of the bills that we've seen, that we've heard in committee, and we're going to continue to hear in both public safety and children and families, are these Band-Aid budget deals where it's like, oh, we need an extra 5 million for this. Oh, we need an extra 6 million for that. It's an emergency. And they'll bring their testifiers talking about how if we don't get this extra funding for the next few months, we're all going to be out on the street and children are going to starve and the world's going to collapse and la-di-da. Well, yeah, because you created an unsustainable system that operates on the brink of collapse at any given moment. And so it's this perpetual emergency of, oh, you got to pass this or everyone's going to die. Well, how about we take a look? How about we take a couple steps back? We look at this apparatus that you've erected and think about it, redesign it from the ground up so that it's not operating in a constant state of crisis, right? Like, have some long-term thinking. This is what we do as cities. At least it's what we did in the city of Albertville. And I'm very grateful for that. My 7-year spent on the city council in Albertville were a breeze, relatively speaking, because the councils previous to mine, to the ones that I sat on, made good, well-informed, well-deliberated, long-term forward-thinking decisions, recognizing their place in a line of custody over municipal government, saying we've got to set up the next guys for success. We did the same thing. And so the people who come after us are going to it's going to be a breeze. All they got to do is keep it on cruise control, make minor adjustments to the steering wheel, and you'll be fine, right? That's the way this is supposed to operate. But it's not the way it operates at either the state or the federal level. And that is by design. It's not because people aren't smart enough to figure it out. It's because the politics of crisis is very lucrative. There's a lot of FTEs, full-time equivalent employees, okay, who make a lot of money collectively off of the perpetual crisis. And that's what this is all about. It's all about it, and we call it the swamp in Washington, D.C. Same deal. The administrative state, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. It's people who make their dime off of it always being a crisis, and there always being a deadline, and it's always an emergency. We always got to do something right now or the kids are going to starve. We need to fix that. And we fix it first and foremost by recognizing the con.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Mankato Free Press down by me had this editorial today about how the Republicans are playing, roulette with this, this tactic of trying to ask for spending cuts to restore some fiscal sanity. And they're saying that, the debt ceiling has been increased by Republicans and Democrats. It's a historically bipartisan thing. It's been going back for decades. And it's like, there isn't an American out there who thinks that it's a good thing to keep adding to the debt. I mean, when I was out in DC in my short time kind of meeting with people out there, I was like, what are we doing about the debt? And it's kind of, I got word, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter. Everyone knows we can't pay it back. It doesn't matter anymore. Well, that's not true. That if you want to see the failure of the American dollar, it's when the markets finally come to realize that we can't pay it back, that you can't recover from this.
Yeah.
And we're just inflicting slavery, indentured servitude on American taxpayers. And it has to stop. We have to turn the ship.
Well, and that might be the best possible outcome in the long term is slavery from the debt. What's more likely to happen is revolution, right? The total societal collapse. I mean, past a certain point, that phrase, full faith and credit of the United States, which is what our dollar is backed with, which is a fancy way of saying hopes and dreams is what it's backed with, is the idea that this is going to be paid back someday. The promise that somebody somewhere down the line is going to pay it back. Well, if that promise evaporates, if, as you say, the market wakes up and realizes, oh man, this piece of paper is worthless. These ones and zeros in my bank account don't actually hold any tangible value. Past that point, people are going to lose their incentive to remain in an orderly society. And when you flip the page on that chapter, we don't know what comes next, but we know it ain't going to be pretty.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people say, why should I pay my taxes if they can just print money endlessly? Like, why are we even contributing money if it's that bad? One of the reasons why I bring this up on the podcast is because tomorrow, in addition to voting on House File 1, you're going to be voting on House File 35, which is another small bill by the Democrats to add inflation into the requirement for forecasting. Now, I'm going to say something that may shock people, but I'm all for tax cuts. But it doesn't make sense to cut taxes if you aren't also cutting spending, right? It is a balance on both sides. So too is the forecast for, hey, we're going to be, bringing in revenue that if you account for inflation is less. And if this, I think we should be honest with people. And so masking the expenditures by not including inflation in that, I think it's a disservice. I think you should accurately forecast what our projections are, because if we don't have the right forecast and the Democrats are in charge, they're going to spend more money than they think they have, right? But at the same time, if you have to add it to both sides, which this bill does. What are your thoughts on this? What are the? I mean, what's the Republican House caucus reaction to this bill?
Well, there isn't a uniform position on it. There's a near uniform position on it, which is that we don't like it because before I go further on what the position is, I think it's important to specify that this bill doesn't really do anything, right? Like it doesn't make it's like the difference between switching the view on your Zoom or whatever, right? Like you click the toggle to either look at one person, look at the speaker, or look at all of them at once. Like that's what it is we're just looking at the same information from a different perspective by adding in the inflation calculation. I mean, everybody knows what inflation is. It's not like this data isn't out there, like it doesn't exist. But what it's going to do is it's going to change the perspective of people who are looking at the information, and it's going to provide a starting point for negotiations when we're talking about budgetary matters, where the baseline number is going to be higher than it is currently under the way it's currently calculated. And so recognizing that that's how it's going to be used, the Republican position, I think, predominantly is going to be opposing assuming inflation into budget forecasts.
That's a fair analysis. I mean, I think that the Democrats' purpose in doing this is to reduce the income forecast so that they can raise taxes, justify raising taxes, so that they can justify that the surplus that they're sitting on right now is basically going to cover the inflated costs of government. But in the end, I think it's a political tactic. The reason why it was taken out was a political ploy, and I don't think it's wrong to include inflation. I think it's being honest with the taxpayers, but I just hope it doesn't. I hope that people can see through it when they try to raise taxes again on people, if that's what their purpose is on this.
Well, that raises up another point. I know I didn't include this on the list of topics I had for you this week, but it is extraordinarily noteworthy that with a $17+ billion state budget surplus, not only are the Democrats proposing spending all of it, but they also are proposing raising taxes. They want to raise taxes with a $17 billion state budget surplus, which goes back to the point we were making earlier regarding Washington, D.C., and the endless thirst, the bottomless hunger for your tax dollars and your full faith and credit going forward, and that of your children and grandchildren. If these people do not have a limitation imposed on them, then they're not going to limit themselves. That's why I support a convention of states. That's why I think we need to have amendments to the Constitution that force the federal government to limit itself and to balance itself and to limit its jurisdiction. And on the state level, I'm looking at, I'm not going to go into too much detail right now because I'm still developing it, but I'm looking at putting forward legislation that would place strict limitations on the amount of money that the state can spend and tie that to some sort of economic indicator of how the people are doing, how the economy is doing, so that we're never spending more in this state than the people who are part of it, or the people who are it, can afford. I think that's an important thing to do going forward. And if someday we're able to enact something like that, what it will do is it will force this place to do something that it always says it's doing, but never actually does, which is set priorities and decide what it is that we're actually here to do and what we're going to fund and what we're going to get done.
Well, I think it's a noble effort. Unfortunately, Republicans and Democrats, when the economy is doing great, they love to spend money. And when the economy is doing poorly, they see a need to help those in need and spend more, even though the economy isn't generating the tax revenue, that it's the time to, help people that are struggling. I want to jump into another topic, Walter. There's a bill that's coming through the legislature to restore the vote for those who are no longer imprisoned. In the podcast, I think last year or the year before, we talked about this, restoring the vote, and how, you said something very impactful. You said, if someone is not in prison, right, they're a felon, they committed the crime, they did the time, they're not a threat to society, they've been released, shouldn't they be able to vote? And it's something I support. I mean, I talked to a lot of people, people that wrote bad checks or whatever. They went to prison for, 9 months. They could have went for 10 years, but they get like 20 years probation and they can't vote for 20 years. And I do think it's unfair. I think once the person has done their sentence, done their time, that they should be allowed to be contributing members of society, including the right to vote. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have to tread a little bit carefully on this. My public statements are out there that I've made in the past as to why I think this is a good concept. I think the thing that needs to be called into question in this moment is the timing and the order of operation, right? So my position, I'll just tell you what my position is, and then we'll talk about how it applies to this current moment and these bills that are coming, because it's more than just one bill. Frazier has a bill that we're going to hear in public safety, that is just standalone, restore the right to vote to people who aren't incarcerated bill. And then I believe the language is included in the election file, what 3 or 4, whatever it is. I think it's House File 3. Their big election bill has the restoration of the right to vote in it as well, I believe. So one way or the other, we're going to be having this conversation. I think all things being equal, you should have the right to vote if you're not incarcerated. And my argument is on a couple of grounds. One, that, well, 3 actually. I think the lowest tier reason is just a matter of logistics and practicality. It's impractical to be going around having to verify, who has felon status and who doesn't, who's on probation and who isn't. It makes the process simpler and streamlines it if you just have, if you're not in prison, you can vote. If you're over 18, you're not in prison, you're a citizen, you otherwise qualify, you should be able to vote. That's the lowest tier, lowest value reason. I think secondarily, as a franchise, as something that is a mark of inclusion within civil society, the right to vote provides a sense of engagement, and it gives people a reason to feel like they're part of something, like they belong, like they're one of us. And when you have that sense that you are part of the society, perhaps you'll be less inclined to offend society, which is how people got into these positions in the first place. But I think the highest tier reason why we ought to take a look at this and consider restoring the right to vote to people who aren't incarcerated is that there was never in the history of our state an affirmative decision made to make this the status quo. The condition, or the clause in the Constitution, as I understand it, that prohibits voting for felons was written and ratified in a time where that meant you were in jail. Like, we didn't have probation in 1858, right? Like that wasn't a thing. They were still hanging people in 1858. We had a much more streamlined criminal justice system, with harsher penalties, and you were either finding yourself at the end of the rope or behind bars, and those were pretty much the 2 options. They didn't let you out and then have supervision and have your probation officer follow you around and call on you. Those are things which developed over time, over the many decades since statehood. And so there was no deliberative body. There was no ballot measure. There was no point at which there was a public conversation where the proposal was made, hey, we should have a whole category of people who are just floating around out there in society, working, earning a living, taking care of their families, paying taxes, who can't vote. Right? Like, that just isn't something that we ever sat down and decided. And so there's a certain there's a word I'm thinking of that can't come to mind, where something is obsolete. There's a certain degree to which this is out of sync with time. And so it's time to have the conversation of, is this something we intend? Is this something we actually desire as a body politic, to have people who aren't in jail, who don't have the right to vote? Now, maybe the answer to that is yes, which brings me to the context of the now and what complicates this issue for me now. And that is, I think that there are a lot of people who aren't in jail who should be. And my evidence is what's happening out there on the street. The fact that the sergeant of arms here at the Capitol advised me personally not to go out a certain door because of the level of crime around the Capitol. Okay. That's my evidence that there's a lot of people out there who should be behind bars. And so for me, the order of operation properly should be, you clean up the criminal justice system to where we got safe streets and the people who should be in prison are in prison. And then you allow the people who aren't in prison to have the right to vote. Right now it's upside down. And so I'm not quite sure, and I haven't made any decisions or anything, but to me, that's a compelling argument to hold off on it, to hold off on voting for it at this time.
Yeah. Well, one of the compromises that I thought would be interesting when Republicans were in the majority, at least in one body, is to say, look, let's support restoring the vote for people that are not in prison. And in exchange, we get voter ID, right? When I had people come to my office to lobby me for restoring the vote, and they were all felons, and I said, what do you guys think about voter ID? Every one of them was supportive of it. Of course, who doesn't have an ID, right? That was a good compromise. Or to say, if
Right.
if the maximum sentence for your crime was 10 years and you did 6 months, then you should at least lose your right to vote for half of the maximum or something, which would, people that get tossed, that should have went to jail and didn't because they pled out, they should at least lose their right to vote for a short period of time or a percentage of the sentence. But having it drag on where their probation is longer than the maximum sentence they could have got, it just that's really lengthy. And in some counties, like my county, they put a cap on the amount of probation time, so that people aren't on probation for 20 years. But many counties, it's not that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll see what ends up happening with it. I think that I think the point that you raise is that this is something that if they want bipartisan support, they should earn it. Because if we were going to be doing this, we would have done it a different way. But of course, they don't need our support, so they'll probably just ram it through regardless, and we won't get anything for it. And hey, to your point, that's what you get for not cutting a deal when you could have. This assumption that was operated under that, well, we'll hold off until we're in charge, or we'll hold off until we win the next election. Well, it turns out you don't always get that opportunity, so you should probably work with the power that you currently have.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Walter, I wish you luck in the next week in the legislature. You got a lot of important votes coming up, and not just the end of this week, but we'll see what next week has in store for you. With Democrats controlling the House and Senate, and Governor Walz pushing for his agenda, they're going to be fast tracking a lot of legislation. There'll be a lot of important votes sooner in the legislative session versus the big, huge omnibus bills that the bipartisan work happened in previous sessions. So you'll see a lot of single subject bills going through to help them with their agenda. And I wish you luck. I hope you speak out on the floor against these terrible bills that are coming forward. And for those listening, if you haven't already been to Walter's legislative page, go out and sign up for his legislative updates. And we'll include some clips in our coverage here today of the committee hearings that Walter's been a part of. Walter, you got final word for people?
Yeah, just, if you're not already paying attention to my Twitter, paying attention to my Facebook page, on Facebook, I believe the username is Hudson for MN, which is the URL for my campaign website. And then on Twitter, it's just at Walter Hudson. And at the rate things are going, you'll be able to get a pretty good preview of the show of the Omnibus podcast as each day goes on, because I'm going to be cutting and posting these clips of these interactions in committees and House floor debates. And it won't always be me either. I mean, I hear or see stuff happening with other members or testifiers or whatever it is that you need to know. To me, that's one of the huge hidden benefits of this job that I didn't expect, is that because I'm here and because my ear's to the ground, a lot of things that were completely under my radar before and were to a larger extent under everybody's radar because they're not here and they don't have their ear to the ground. I'm going to have the opportunity to clip them and magnify them and let you get a peek behind the statist curtain down here in St. Paul.
Yeah, one thing I did want to bring up with you quickly was you posted a clip of a gal who was testifying for driver's licenses for all, and she identified herself as being someone who was in this country unlawfully, and so as an illegal immigrant, she said, "We vote, we are voting, and we will vote you out." Which I copied that clip and put it out on Twitter, and it's it's gotten some pretty big attention because do we have a problem with people that are not citizens who are voting in our elections and shouldn't be, or do we not? Is this not proof that people are voting and are going to vote you out?
Yeah, I mean, so there's been some ambiguity around that clip. So I heard that was a perfect example of I'm walking down the hall with a few other members, and one of them's like, "Oh, by the way, this crazy thing happened in committee today. This gal said that illegals are voting, and she just came right out and said it, and threatened that they were going to vote us all out if we didn't pass driver's licenses for all." I'm like, "Really? What committee?" And of course, you can go back and look at the video, and I pull it and I rip it and I clip it, and before you know it, we got a viral moment. And I can't wait for the dozens of those that are going to happen over the next few months down here in St. Paul. It's going to be a lot of fun. But there's been some ambiguity surrounding her and her status. So at first, I didn't make any assumptions. Like, I don't know who she is. She identifies herself as an Augsburg student. She didn't say anything about her legal status. To me, that wasn't the point. The point was that she's inferring that our people, like, who are our people? What does she mean by that? And surprisingly enough, Common Cause of Minnesota came out with a tweet answering that question. They claimed that she was speaking on behalf of all Latinx Minnesotans, as they put it, which is itself interesting because you're making the claim then on behalf of an entire ethnic group that they support illegal immigration, which we know is not true. We know for a fact that Hispanics are not overwhelmingly supportive of illegal immigration because most of them are legal residents and legal immigrants and don't approve of that. But be that as it may, there was some back and forth. People, of course, one of the things that people were saying was, "Oh, she's not illegal. Why are you posting this?" Blah blah blah. There were claims that she's actually Native American. But then Alpha News had a story I saw, and I haven't read it, but I saw the headline identifying her as a DACA recipient. And my understanding of being a DACA recipient, in order for that to apply to you, that means you don't have legal status, or you were granted limited legal status. It means that you were an illegal immigrant. That's what it means. And so if that's true, then the original conception of this clip was accurate. Yes, you have an illegal person telling elected members of the House of Representatives that illegals are going to vote them out if they don't pass driver's licenses for all.
Yeah, and when I posted it, I made it very clear. If you're an immigrant to this country, you can get a driver's license, right? If you are lawful, if you follow the law in how you come here. If it's only the undocumented, the people who don't have permission to be here, who cannot get a driver's license, and that was what the legislation is about. So if you're there testifying in favor for that community of people to get driver's licenses, and you reference that they are voting and that that community is going to vote you out, that's exactly what you're applying. Now, I work with a bunch of technology people in my day job, and in 2016, several Indian nationals showed me pictures of them voting for Hillary Clinton. And when they said that they set up a voting booth in their apartment building, and they went there and asked if they could vote, and the person said, "Well, do you live here?" "Yeah." "Do you have a cable bill or something to show the proof of residency?" "Yeah, I have a cable bill." "Well, I don't have one." "Well, could you vouch for him?" "Sure." So they brought cable bills and vouched for each other to vote in the 2016 election. They showed me pictures of them voting, and I explained to them, they can't vote. And they said, no, they can. They asked, they got all the information, they did. So proof of people who were H-1B visas, they were lawful residents, but not citizens, and they couldn't vote. And it is just that, and it would be just as easy for someone who's undocumented to go vote as well, simply by showing a cable bill or a utility bill or having someone vouch for them. And when they do that and they vote, the ballot is counted the same day. And once it's in that box, there's no pulling it out.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the point needs to be emphasized that what you are describing is the status quo. So before the Democrats do anything this session, as it stands today, all you need to do is show up with a cable bill or a gas bill or something and claim to live somewhere, and you can register to vote and cast a ballot that will be counted because we do not have provisional ballots in this state. That's the status quo. With House Files 3 and 4, the election bill and the driver's licenses for all, respectively, the Democrat, that's not loose enough. That's not loosey-goosey enough for the Democrats. They want to make it even crazier. So now they're going to make it to where your driver's license doesn't even, you don't even have to verify where you live or that you're a legal resident in order to get a driver's license. So anybody can just claim to live anywhere without proving it and get a driver's license that says, hey, I live here. I'm a resident. And then they automatically get registered to vote and can cast a ballot that will be counted. It's insane to the extreme. That's what this, they have, the word has gone out. And, you know, this is something we heard through the grapevine. The word has gone out amongst the Democrat caucus, which is full of freshmen, just like we have them here, to go big or go home. This is going to be a transformative session. You need to get out there and throw all the spaghetti at the wall. Anything you can dream of, write the bill. They have no limitation on what they are willing to propose and pass. And the United States, and not just in Minnesota, all of us throughout America are about to get a glimpse at what happens when there are no guardrails whatsoever placed upon a state. Now, of course, we can already look at California and see how it's working out there. Not very well. Well, you're about to get a taste of it here, only worse, because when Tim Walz looks at California, when Melissa Wortman looks at California, they don't see a cautionary tale. They say, hold my beer.
Well, we'll get into it next week again, Walter. I wish you luck in the next week, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.